In this first of a series of videos on Greek temples, I want to talk to you about the basic components of a Greek temple. Now this week we're focusing on wood as a building material, and you might wonder, why are we starting with Greek temples? Well, I want to talk about roofing systems in the next couple of days. The wooden roofing systems that support the roofs of buildings and allow you to cover large enclosed spaces. And Greek temples are an interesting example because they have a roofing system which is called the prop and lintel roofing system, and I'll quickly show it to you over here. The prop or post is the vertical piece coming down, and the lintel or beam is going horizontal. And so this was the main roofing system that supported the Greek temple. And there are limitations to what the Greek architects could actually build with this system of roofing. There are some problems with it. And so I'm going to look and talk about the prop and lintel system and what those limitations were, and then how a new framing system came into being, which is the truss. So this is a wooden truss, and this was brought in mainly by the Romans, although we do believe that some late Greek temples actually used a wooden truss to span these spaces like this. So our focus is on the wood, but before we talk about the wood, we need to know a little bit about Greek temples. Ancient Greek society was politically organized around city-states, which were large cities that controlled the land around them, and they were constantly fighting with each other for wealth and power and prestige. But another way that a city could exhibit its wealth and prestige would be to build an impressive temple to a deity. And probably most of us are familiar with the Parthenon, which is in Athens today. This is sort of a model of what we think it looks like. It is a ruin now, although they are restoring it. And so this was dedicated to the goddess Athena. Now, when you look at this wooden or this white model here, you'll notice that everything that's in white is made out of stone. Why is that? Well, stone is very, very durable. The earliest Greek temples actually were made out of wood. But the problem with wood is that it rots, it can catch on fire, it burns, and it's not really that prestigious. Whereas if you build a temple out of limestone or marble, it's going to last for centuries. It's not going to catch on fire, it's going to look beautiful. It's very, very expensive to build, which means that only the largest, most wealthiest city-states could build massive, massive temples. So what is the purpose of a Greek temple? Well, apart from sort of the prestige and wealth of the city, really it has two other main functions. One is to hold the statue of a god or deity. You can see I've got a statue in here, and this statue happens to be inside a room in the center of the temple called the cella. And then often there was a back room in the back of the temple where cult materials would be stored. It could be used as a storeroom for the city or a treasury or a bank. But the main focus is to hold this beautiful statue that was sitting in here. So let's look at some of the parts of a temple. I'm not going to do most of the parts, I'm just going to do some of the main parts. You can see on the outside there are rows of columns. These are called a colonnade. And if you look at the front entrance, you can see into the cella where the cult statue is. As you walk through this entrance, you'll go through a small room called the pronaxos, or the porch, and then you enter the main space, which is the cella. And that actually is going to be the focus of the next couple of days. The major limitation the Greeks had was how wide this cella could be. There were limits to the prop and lintel system in terms of how wide they could make this space. And if you want to really impress your neighbors, you want to make as large a temple as possible. And so this is our focus, is what are the limits of the prop and lintel system that determine how wide the cella could be. So let's take another look at this model. You can see this is a typical ruin. All the stone is still there, but clearly there are parts that are missing. And there are clues in the stonework. You can see these notches here that tell us that there must have been wooden beams in these regions supporting the roof. We also know that the roof was made out of clay tile, and we do have archaeological remains of clay tile, and that is very, very heavy. So you needed an extremely strong roofing system to support that very, very heavy clay tile. The problem is there is no example today of a Greek temple wooden roof system. They've all rotted away. So partly what we're going to talk about here is really hypothesis. But there is some good evidence about the dimension, size, and scale of the wood that was fitting in these notches. Now, if you're really interested in this topic, I would strongly suggest reading The Woodwork of Greek Roofs by Mr. Hodge here, and another book is also Ancient Greek Architects at Work by Colton. Both of these books are excellent resources if you want to know a little bit more about the architecture of Greek temples and the evidence we have for the construction of their roofs. So let's go back to our model, and I'm going to sort of put in some wood just to give you a sense of what it might have looked like. So I'm going to put in, first of all, these big beams that are going across like this. So remember, a beam actually is a horizontal element, and there's an important thing to note about a beam. If you put force on a beam, so imagine you've got this heavy roof that's being supported, and you put a force, apply a force on the beam will bend. Now what's great about wood is that it is relatively strong in compression. So if you're pushing down on wood, it's pretty strong in compression. And it's also relatively strong in tension, which is pulling. Now what happens though when you apply a load to a beam? Well, both tension and compression happen. And hopefully you can see it over here in this diagram over here. Let's go over and look at that. So if here is a horizontal beam and you've got a load pushing down here, what actually happens is the beam will start to sag. And the top of the beam will be pushed together. So the top surface of the beam will be in compression and the bottom surface will pull apart and be in tension. So you need a material that is good in both tension and compression for a beam. And so that's why the ancient Greeks did use wood. It is relatively strong in both tension and compression. But you can't use stone for a beam. So there'd be no point in building these beams out of stone because the stone would literally break. Because remember, stone is very strong in compression, but it's very, very weak in tension. So it would literally crack at the bottom here. Now there are beams, stone beams in the structure, and they are spanning between the columns here. But that distance is not that wide. And so once again, there are limitations on how wide they could put the columns apart based on the tensile strength of stone, which was pretty low. So the wooden framework had to be built out of wood. This roofing framework, it had to be wood, not stone, because of wood's properties. So let's throw a few more beams on here. Now, the Greeks had to cut down massive trees for these beams. These beams, although wood is fairly strong, it did need to be very large, wide beams. And there's a limit to the number of large trees in Greece. If you go to Greece today, there's very few large trees left. They've all been cut down. So there were some problems in getting access to really massive beams to support these roofs. A danger of wood, of course, is that if you have fire, the beams will burn down. But I guess you can always replace the beams by putting new beams in here. So I'm putting some of the wooden framework in that we know existed because of these notches in the stonework. So you can now see that we have placed some of these wooden beams here. But we've got some problems because this span is way too long. The wood, the heavy tiles would literally cause this wood to break. So there does need to be some other supports added here. And so that's where the prop and lintel system comes in. And so what I'm going to do next in my next video is talk in more detail about the prop and lintel system and how it works and the limitations that imposed on Greek architects. So hopefully that is a good introduction to the Greek temple. And remember, one of the key things we're talking about today is this idea of the fact that a beam is under both compression and tension, and that a beam needs to be built out of wood, not stone, because wood can handle both compression and tension. It's relatively strong. And what we're going to be talking about is the width of the cella. Remember, the cella is the internal space or room inside a Greek temple that housed the cult statue. And so we're going to talk about the limitations of how wide the Greeks could make this space. Okay, so that's video 1, and why don't you look at video 2, which will be in more detail about the prop and lintel system.